August 15, 1893, the Newport police received a frantic telegram that ignited one of the Gilded Age's darkest unsolved mysteries. Evangeline Cunningham, just 23 years old and heiress to a $40 million railroad fortune, vanished without a trace from her family's oceanfront mansion in the middle of Newport's most exclusive social event. What investigators discovered in her private chambers turned a disappearance into a nightmare. Photographs of 13 of Newport's most powerful families, covered in strange symbols, a leather-bound journal listing names, dates and dollar amounts pointing to a network of blackmail and murder, and forged death certificates showing multiple arsenic poisonings disguised as accidents. For more than a century, the Cunningham family's wealth and influence buried these revelations, insisting Evangeline died in an accident overseas. Federal agents who tried to follow the evidence were blocked by judges tied to the same railroad fortunes, and newspaper editors who showed interest in the story quickly silenced themselves after quiet visits from elegant men who hinted at consequences for spreading such rumors. Recently uncovered court files and letters found hidden in a demolished Providence mansion tell a very different story. Evangeline had been working with private investigators, foreign reporters, and federal agents to expose what they called the American conspiracy, a ruthless alliance of industry and politics that eliminated anyone threatening their control. These new documents suggest her disappearance was part of a larger pattern that silenced at least 37 people who had uncovered secrets about a cabal known as the Newport Compact, a pact between the nation's richest families who divided the country's wealth among themselves and would kill to protect it. In the summer of 1893, Newport was the dazzling capital of American high society, a place of endless marble palaces and glittering parties. But beneath the surface, it was a world of secrecy and violence. The transformation of the town into what newspapers called America's Monte Carlo had cost dozens of immigrant lives whose deaths were erased. Behind the scenes, these elite families had turned Newport into a fortress where they planned marriages, mergers, and strategies to crush any challenge. At the top of this glittering yet dangerous world stood the Cunningham family. Heiress and Cunningham's Baltimore and Newport Railroad linked the industrial Northeast and made him over $40 million, rich with secret companies, adding tens of millions more in hidden mines, timber, and shipping. Their Windward Hall estate, with its 68 rooms and treasures from Europe, also hid a private telegraph office, a blast-proof vault, and tunnels to neighboring mansions, a reminder that Newport society was built as much on control as on wealth. But it was Evangeline who posed the greatest threat from within. With an education in philosophy, literature law, and accounting from years in Europe, fluency in 4 languages, and a relentless curiosity, she returned to Newport determined to investigate the rot at the heart of her world. At 23, she had already refused marriage offers from European nobility and wealthy heirs, not out of love, but because she had discovered that each suitor's family was tied to the same corruption she planned to expose. By the summer of 1893, Evangeline Cunningham had uncovered just how deep the rot went. Her careful investigation revealed that the European counts pursuing her were little more than polished emissaries for powerful banking interests that laundered profits from deadly American industrial accidents. While the son of the Pennsylvania steel magnate who courted her had personally overseen mining operations where more than 40 men died in collapses that could have been prevented. That season in Newport was fraught with tension, not just for the Cunninghams, but for all the families bound by the Newport Compact. Heiress Cunningham's health was failing, and his strange symptoms mirrored those of other magnates who had begun to question the group's methods. At the same time, rivals and allies whispered about the future of the railroad empire. Several recent accidents that had conveniently removed possible challengers only fueled these questions. According to the terms of her grandfather's will, Evangeline would inherit the entire fortune, but only if she married before her 25th birthday, a clause that gave her leverage at every gathering that summer. She used it shrewdly, hinting that her willingness to comply might depend on the answers she received about the business dealings that underpinned her family's fortune. The larger world added another layer of volatility. That same spring, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad collapsed, triggering a wave of bank failures and bankruptcies in what became known as the Panic of 1893. Outwardly, Newport seemed immune. The palaces gleamed, the parties continued, but behind the facades, fortunes crumbled. Many of these losses were not accidents at all. The compact had engineered the panic, manipulating credit and orchestrating collapses so they could snatch up companies for pennies while keeping their own wealth safe in foreign banks and shell corporations. In this manufactured crisis, Evangeline's vast inheritance became a glittering prize, a magnet for suitors and schemers alike. The mood in Newport that summer was further sharpened by the presence of European visitors, bankers, and industrialists eager to buy into America's future. Many of them, however, were unprepared for the brutality they found beneath Newport's cultured surface. One of them, Count Friedrich von Stauffen, a German financier, noted in his private diary that the so-called American competition resembled medieval warfare conducted with modern weapons. He wrote of feudal fiefdoms, where business barons ruled their territories with methods that even the most ruthless of his European peers would find shocking. The Count had witnessed a number of telling moments, including a confrontation at a garden party on the Peaton estate. He saw Theodore Peaton argue with a man who appeared to be a federal official before abruptly handing over a leather briefcase, after which the man left without a word. When von Stauffen asked quietly about the strange exchange, he was told such business dealings were none of a guest's concern. All of this was the backdrop to the night of August 14th, 1893. The Cunninghams' Summer's End Ball, the final great party of the season, was more than an evening of music and dancing. It was a show of power, a meeting of the compact's inner circle. Over 300 guests filled Windward Hall, the elite of America and Europe, joined by politicians, judges, journalists, and businessmen, whose loyalty ensured the compact's grip on the nation's commerce. Electric lights, still a marvel in 1893, bathed the mansion in brilliance. A private telephone exchange buzzed in secret rooms, and the gardens glowed with hundreds of Chinese lanterns, while hidden calcium spotlights stood ready to flood the grounds in case of danger. That night's guest list was a map of influence Senator Marcus Hale, who had repeatedly voted down railroad safety laws; Judge Cornelius Weatherby, who had quashed lawsuits against industrialists; Dr. Edmund Sheffield, whose falsified medical certificates turned corporate negligence into acts of God. Foreign diplomats were there too quietly finalizing deals that traded market access for personal bribes. And amid all this wealth and power, Evangeline appeared radiant in a pale blue silk gown and adorned with the famed Cunningham sapphires, their sparkling stones hiding a secret compartment where she carried her most damning evidence. Observers said she seemed unusually animated, full of an energy that seemed equal parts excitement and resolve, though there was a strain in her expression, as if she knew she was standing on the edge of something irreversible. During the first waltz, she drew close to Mrs. Eleanor Sedgwick, the sharp and watchful wife of a Boston banker, who had been conducting her own investigation into the financial underpinnings of the railroads. Leaning in so no one else could hear, Evangeline whispered with urgency, "Elena, if something happens to me tonight, remember that you saw me speaking with Theodore Piton near the conservatory." At exactly 9:15 that night, Evangeline pressed a small key into Mrs. Sedgwick's gloved hand and whispered urgently, "Remember the time. Remember that I gave you this." Post Office Box 247 in Providence. The combination is my birthday reversed. Whatever you find there, make sure it reaches the Boston Herald and the New York World at the same time. Her words hung like a warning bell in the glittering air of the ballroom. Theodore Piton, the 34-year-old heir to a Pittsburgh steel empire, and one of her most determined suitors, was never far from her mind that evening. His courtship was never about love. He needed her fortune to rescue himself from gambling debts that had grown past $200,000. Those debts were no longer owned by his original creditors. They belonged to the Newport Compact itself, making him a pawn. Witnesses noticed him in several tense arguments with Heiress and Cunningham that night. According to testimony from James Weatherby, who overheard fragments of these conversations, Harrison was pressing Piton to consider more decisive solutions to what he called the Evangeline problem. Piton hesitated, worried that any sudden move could spark international complications because of Evangeline's ties to European journalists and investigators. Through those connections, she had been funneling documents to reporters at the London Times, the Paris Figaro, and the Berlin Tageblatt. They were already drafting exposes about American industrial corruption on a scale that could provoke sanctions and diplomatic scandal if published. The Compact had bribed and threatened to bury some of these stories. But Evangeline's continued cooperation was the only way to keep the rest contained. As the evening went on, she seemed to move with deliberate purpose through the ballroom, drawing guests aside for long conversations. Several later said it felt as if she was probing their loyalties, testing who could be trusted. Professor Marcus Aldrich of Yale remembered being stunned when she approached him with precise questions about archaeological methods for preserving delicate documents and artifacts underground. She pressed him about whether paper and ink could survive decades if sealed properly and buried in coastal soil. Edmund Sheffield, the state medical examiner, would later admit that she had drawn him into what he thought was a harmless discussion about forensic science, only to realize afterward that she had been asking detailed technical questions about detecting poison in decomposed remains, knowledge well beyond the reach of a society debutante. At 10:30 p.m., in the middle of the night's height, Evangeline excused herself from the ballroom, saying she wanted to retrieve a family heirloom for Count von Stauffen, who had been asking about the history of the Cunningham railroads. It seemed like a charming gesture, but in reality, it was a signal they had prearranged. Von Stauffen, far from just a guest, was a German banker investigating financial irregularities on behalf of European investors who suspected American fraud. Evangeline's reference to documents was his cue to be ready. She planned to hand him the final evidence that would expose the compact on an international scale. The last known sighting of her came at 10:45 p.m., when James Weatherby met her descending the grand staircase. She moved quickly, carrying a small leather case and a bulky canvas bag. When he offered to accompany her, she smiled and refused. "There are some truths that matter more than social propriety, James. Some secrets that can no longer be kept. Your father will understand soon enough," she told him. She also mentioned that certain letters had already been sent that day, letters that would guarantee the truth would outlive her. She added a cryptic note about insurance policies already set in motion. An hour later, when she still hadn't returned, her mother sent servants to her room. They found it empty. A window facing the ocean stood open. Valuables and cash were gone, and the private safe had been unlocked with its correct combination. Its contents, whatever they had been, were missing. The room bore signs of a frantic search by multiple intruders after she had left. Furniture had been shifted, hidden compartments opened, and even the floorboards pried up and replaced. It was clear that others knew exactly what she had been hiding and were desperate to find it before it reached the wrong hands. The immediate aftermath of Evangeline Cunningham's disappearance pulled back the curtain on just how tightly Newport's elite controlled both information and perception. Rather than relying on the police, Heiress and Cunningham moved at once to secure the services of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, ensuring that the first and most crucial phase of the investigation stayed within private hands. It was a move that allowed the family to manage the flow of evidence and public statements, while revealing how deeply compromised local law enforcement had already become. Captain William Harrington, an experienced Pinkerton investigator known for unraveling corporate crimes, began by meticulously combing through Evangeline's private belongings and questioning the household staff. What he uncovered was astonishing. Behind secret panels in a writing desk were letters and papers that showed Evangeline had been conducting a quiet, far-reaching investigation for years. Correspondence with lawyers, federal agents, bankers, and detectives from cities across America, and even from London and Paris, revealed that she had been collecting evidence of fraud, bribes, and cover-ups at the very highest levels of business and government. Harrington noted in his private records that the collection she left behind was unlike anything he had seen in 20 years on the job. These were not vague suspicions. They were photographs of clandestine meetings, financial ledgers that tracked bribe money through shadow companies, and carefully preserved copies of forged contracts and safety certificates. Most chilling was her coded personal journal, which experts from the Treasury Department spent 3 weeks deciphering. Its contents painted an unflinching portrait of Newport's power brokers, chronicling their private scandals, political manipulations, and secret deals. The journal was explicit about how the compact colluded to fix railroad rates, crush competition, and use unsafe materials, while making sure the consequences of their decisions fell on workers and ordinary citizens. Just 2 days before her disappearance, Evangeline had written an entry naming Theodore Peaton directly. The Peaton contracts are fraudulent. Proof secured grade A, steel specified grade C delivered. TP authorized the substitution knowing it would fail. Henley died for discovering it. Webb bribed to conceal it. Her words referred to the Baltimore Bridge, a vital rail crossing that had collapsed 6 months earlier during rush hour, killing 17 and injuring dozens. The official explanation, a freak ice storm, was now exposed as a cover story. According to Evangeline's notes, it was greed, not weather, that brought the bridge down. If true, this meant Peaton and others bore responsibility not only for fraud, but for murder disguised as an act of God. As Harrington's investigation deepened, he found more evidence that the tragedy of the Baltimore Bridge was not an isolated case. There was a pattern of accidents and suspicious deaths tied to the businesses of Newport's elite. In just 5 years, at least 18 individuals who had investigated safety violations, labor abuses, or financial irregularities died suddenly in circumstances labeled accidental. The case that most haunted Harrington was that of David Cavendish, a federal railway inspector, who 18 months earlier had been looking into safety problems on the Baltimore and Newport line. Cavendish was found dead in his hotel room, supposedly from a heart attack. But his widow swore he had been in excellent health and had recently undergone a federal medical exam. She revealed that for weeks before his death, he had been receiving anonymous threats and had even taken out a large life insurance policy after telling her he had stumbled upon evidence of a conspiracy connecting businessmen, judges, and politicians. When she tried to deliver her husband's files to federal authorities, the documents vanished from her home during the funeral, taken by someone who had entered without breaking a single lock. Desperate for answers, she reached out directly to the Cunningham family for access to safety records. Days later, two elegantly dressed strangers appeared at her door. They spoke gently but firmly, insisting her husband's death was the result of a misunderstanding and advising her to let the matter rest. Though they made no explicit threats, their meaning was unmistakable. The case of Cavendish, like so many others, was quietly erased, leaving only a widow with unasked questions and a warning of what happened to those who challenged the Newport Compact. The men who visited Mrs. Cavendish had made it clear that silence was the safest course. They warned her that her late husband's federal pension could be jeopardized if his investigation were declared improperly handled, and even hinted that her job as a school teacher might be threatened should reports of her unstable state reach the local authorities. Not long after, she received an anonymous payment large enough to relocate, along with a note advising her to start fresh in a new city, free from the burden of grief. She left for Oregon and never spoke of the matter publicly again. But before disappearing from public view, she secretly passed copies of her husband's notes to a trusted journalist friend. That journalist, Michael O'Connor of the Baltimore Sun, took up the investigation with determination, only to encounter a wall of resistance. Documents he requested were said to be misfiled or destroyed, and when he sought out federal inspectors who might corroborate Cavendish's findings, he discovered that they had been scattered, some reassigned to remote posts, others promoted to positions where they no longer had access to relevant records. Even more disturbing, O'Connor learned that Cavendish's death was not an isolated event. In the previous 3 years, 7 federal inspectors investigating railroad safety had died in circumstances that were on the surface unconnected, but together formed a chilling pattern. 3 died suddenly of heart attacks, despite being in good health. 2 perished in hotel fires that consumed their investigation files. Another drowned under suspicious conditions that suggested he had been drugged. The last was murdered in what police called a random robbery, only days before he was due to testify before Congress. The most damning revelation to come from Evangeline's hidden files was a coded document. She had broken a price list for services provided by an entity calling itself the Newport Adjustment Bureau. The prices ranged from $5,000 for temporary persuasion to $50,000 for permanent resolution with full documentation cleanup. In essence, it was a menu of intimidation, sabotage, and assassination designed for the business elite. Harrington's team followed this lead and confirmed that the Bureau operated out of offices in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, presenting itself as a consultancy. But when the investigators tried to track them, they found nothing. Offices emptied, staff vanished, and all records erased. 3 weeks after Evangeline disappeared, Harrington uncovered the clue that would change everything. While inspecting the estate grounds near the conservatory, a location where Evangeline had last been seen in conversation with Theodore Peaton, he noticed that a patch of soil looked recently disturbed. The location was oddly exposed, visible from several windows of the mansion, as though whoever had buried something there believed themselves untouchable. Using careful military-style excavation techniques, Harrington's team unearthed a metal container wrapped in oiled canvas and sealed with wax. It was waterproof, secure, and buried about 4 feet underground. Inside lay the documents that had gone missing from Evangeline's safe, along with even more explosive evidence. The cache detailed decades of embezzlement from the Baltimore and Newport Railroad's worker pension fund, forged safety inspection reports for at least a dozen major construction projects, correspondence proving systematic bribery of judges, politicians, and federal officials, and most damning of all, a web of letters and agreements tying Newport's wealthiest families to an international network of criminal enterprises. These papers revealed that what Evangeline had called the Newport Compact was only the American branch of a much larger machine, a transnational alliance of powerful families in America, England, Germany, France, and Russia. This network, which had been quietly coordinating its operations since the 1870s, manipulated industries, governments, and markets, with ruthless efficiency enforcing its dominance through blackmail, sabotage, and murder disguised as accidents. What Harrington uncovered in that buried archive made it clear that Evangeline Cunningham had not simply been a rebellious heiress. She had been preparing to strike at the very heart of one of the most dangerous and secretive conspiracies of the Gilded Age. The archive that Captain Harrington uncovered revealed the terrifying reach of the Newport Compact and how its international connections made it far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. These links to Europe and beyond gave the compact the ability to launder money, hide assets, move operatives across borders, eliminate inconvenient people in multiple countries, and even manipulate commodity markets on a global scale. At the heart of the archive was a chilling organizational chart. At the top sat the 7 great American families, each one dominating a different sector: railroads, steel, coal shipping, banking, textiles, and agricultural commodities. Beneath them was an intricate web of controlled entities, law firms, detective agencies, medical practices, newspapers, and even funeral homes, which were used for discreet disposal of bodies. One section labeled in Evangeline's neat handwriting as the American Death List cataloged decades of bloodshed. It named every victim silenced since 1877. Federal investigators, journalists, labor leaders, competitors, and even family members who threatened to expose them. For each person, the list included the reason they were a threat, the chosen method of elimination, and the amount paid for the operation. There were at least 43 such murders carried out over 16 years, using methods that ranged from poison and staged accidents to sophisticated assassinations disguised as random crime. Some names stood out. Congressman William Hayes of Ohio, who had been leading a congressional investigation into railroad safety, officially declared dead of a heart attack in 1891, but in reality poisoned at a dinner at the Union Club attended by compact members. Sarah Mitchell of the Chicago Tribune, whose explosive investigation into corruption ended when she was drugged and burned alive in a hotel fire designed to destroy both her and her files. Among these documents was one that froze Harrington's blood, a death warrant for Evangeline Cunningham, handwritten by Judge Cornelius Weatherby and countersigned by Theodore Peaton and Harrison Cunningham. Dated 3 days before the summer's end ball, it read, "The EC situation has become untenable. Foreign complications require immediate resolution. Recommend permanent solution with careful attention to documentary cleanup. Suggest maritime disposal to prevent forensic complications. Authorization granted for expenditure up to $75,000 for comprehensive resolution." Attached was a meticulous plan, a drug to mimic heart failure disposal of her weighted body in deep ocean waters from a private yacht, and a prepared cover story claiming she fled to Europe with a lover and died in a tragic accident abroad. The plan even identified 2 witnesses, Margaret Flynn and Patrick O'Brien, who would need to be silenced if they complicated the narrative, with instructions to discredit Flynn's mental state and to transfer or accidentally eliminate O'Brien if required. Harrington understood immediately that this discovery placed him in grave danger. With this evidence, he now had undeniable proof of a conspiracy that stretched into the highest levels of American power. Yet he also knew that the compact had both the will and the means to destroy anyone who threatened them. The reaction was swift. Within days of finding the archive, Harrington found himself pressured by his own Pinkerton superiors to abandon the murder theory and embrace the notion that Evangeline had run away with a lover. When he refused, the Cunningham family lodged formal complaints, leading to attempts to have him removed from the case. Then came the intimidation. His hotel room was entered while he was out interviewing witnesses, no item stolen, but his notes were rifled through. Anonymous letters arrived, warning that his wife and children in Chicago might be in danger. He learned that strangers had been asking about his finances, his habits, and his vulnerabilities. Understanding the peril he faced, Harrington quietly made copies of the most damning documents, hiding them in several secret locations and arranging for their delivery to trusted associates if anything happened to him. He then officially concluded the case, submitting a report that supported the narrative of Evangeline's voluntary disappearance. Unofficially, however, he continued his investigation in secret. As he followed these hidden threads, Harrington came to realize that Evangeline's disappearance was not a random act, but the culmination of a campaign to silence the most dangerous threat the compact had ever faced. What set Evangeline apart was not only her privileged access to the family's secrets, but her intelligence and strategy, her ability to preserve evidence in hidden caches, to spread her findings across different investigators and journalists, and to ensure that the truth could outlive her. Through this underground investigation, Harrington discovered that Evangeline had been part of a loose but determined network of allies. Federal investigators, reform-minded journalists, and even members of the elite who had turned against their own. The most important of these allies was Dr. Helena Ashford, a physician and reformer who had stumbled upon the compact's influence in medicine. Dr. Ashford had begun by studying the care of workers injured in railroad accidents and found a disturbing pattern. Certain doctors consistently downplayed the severity of injuries, ensuring victims could not win legal cases. She uncovered that these physicians were secretly paid by companies to falsify diagnoses, and that in many cases, hospitals quietly disposed of bodies to prevent autopsies from revealing poisoning or criminal negligence. By the time she crossed paths with Evangeline, Dr. Ashford had documented 37 suspicious worker deaths, where bodies were hastily buried, records conveniently lost, and grieving families deceived. Every attempt to present her findings was blocked. Boards dismissed her claims, hospitals claimed records were destroyed, and soon the threats came: anonymous letters warning that meddling lady doctors would see their careers ruined or their lives endangered. These investigations made her a perfect ally for Evangeline, whose network had grown bold enough to challenge the Newport Compact itself. By the summer of 1893, the threats against Dr. Helena Ashford had evolved from warnings to a full-scale campaign of destruction. When intimidation failed, rumors began to spread through medical circles that she was incompetent, unstable, and morally questionable. These lies were meant to isolate her and destroy her credibility. Her connection to Evangeline began when the young heiress approached her under the guise of being a curious dilettante interested in forensic medicine. Very quickly, Dr. Ashford realized that Evangeline was no idle society woman. She asked precise technical questions about how to detect poisons in human remains, and her grasp of investigative methods was astonishing. What started as a consultation grew into a powerful partnership. Over several months, Evangeline provided funding access and inside information, while Dr. Ashford supplied the medical expertise that could turn suspicion into irrefutable evidence. Together, they built an investigation that was far more detailed and rigorous than anything a single investigator could have managed. Evangeline's knowledge of banking and business traced the money and bribery, while Dr. Ashford's expertise exposed the patterns of deaths and deliberate cover-ups. Their alliance made them formidable and deadly dangerous to the Newport Compact. In retaliation, the Compact escalated their efforts to destroy Dr. Ashford. Colleagues were warned to avoid her. Patients were told she was unstable. Hospitals were threatened with the loss of elite funding if they gave her privileges. Her home was broken into twice, her files examined, and her mail tampered with. Anonymous letters described her daily movements in unnerving detail, and someone even attempted to sabotage her medical supplies, switching medications with toxic substances in a way that could have led to accidental patient deaths. In response, both women developed elaborate systems to protect their work. Evangeline set up a network of safety deposit boxes, encrypted telegram codes, and overseas allies. Dr. Ashford created her own system of caches and automatic disclosures. Their greatest creation, however, was the insurance policy, a comprehensive document so complete and devastating that if it was released, it would guarantee federal investigations, foreign diplomatic crises, and criminal prosecutions on a scale no amount of bribery or intimidation could stop. This document not only chronicled the Newport Compact's past crimes, but included evidence of ongoing corruption and even predicted future actions. These predictions ensured that even if the two women were silenced, the events they foresaw would prove the rest of their evidence true. On the night of the Summer's End ball, Evangeline carried a copy of this policy in the leather case James Weatherby saw in her hands as she descended the staircase. Her intention was to confront the Compact with their crimes in front of their own guests, demand restitution, and warn that refusal would trigger the release of the evidence to newspapers, prosecutors, and foreign governments. What she did not know was that the Compact's intelligence network had been monitoring her for months. Though they did not know everything she had prepared, they had learned enough to understand she posed an existential threat. It was this intelligence that led to Judge Weatherby's signed authorization for her elimination, a permanent solution rather than further attempts at intimidation. The confrontation in her private chambers that night was no accident. It was a planned operation involving not just Theodore Peaton and Judge Weatherby, but other members of the Compact who were placed around Windward Hall to ensure the plan went smoothly without interference. Yet before that confrontation took place, Evangeline managed one final act of defiance. Harrington's later reconstruction of events revealed that sometime during the evening, she succeeded in activating at least part of her disclosure network. Using pre-arranged codes, she sent telegrams to allies across the country and in Europe. Even if she were silenced, the machine she had built would continue moving forward, ensuring that what she had uncovered would eventually come to light. And so, just when Newport thought it had buried the truth with Evangeline Cunningham, her final desperate move guaranteed that the secrets of the Compact would begin to unravel. If this story has sent chills down your spine, share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. Tap the like button to keep these stories alive, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter in America's buried conspiracies. The truth of Evangeline Cunningham's final hours only came into focus months later, when Captain Harrington, still working unofficially, received a confession from Margaret Flynn, her loyal maid. Flynn's courage in breaking her silence reshaped everything that was known about that night. Her testimony, later supported by evidence Evangeline had hidden in the mansion, exposed not a moment of chaos, but a deliberate and calculated operation designed to destroy a single young woman who had threatened to bring down an empire. Flynn explained that from early in the evening, she had noticed strange patterns in the household guests slipping in and out of Heiress and Cunningham's private study, where a temporary command center had been set up. By 11:15 p.m., she heard voices coming from Evangeline's chambers. This time, she didn't settle for listening at the keyhole. Using the secret network of servant corridors built into Windward Hall, she found a narrow vantage point that allowed her to watch through a concealed panel. What she saw was not a heated quarrel, but an interrogation. Theodore Peaton Judge, Weatherby Harrison Cunningham, Dr. Edmund Sheffield, and two unfamiliar men, hard-eyed and professional, almost certainly hired muscle, had cornered Evangeline. On a table in front of her lay a document demanding that she surrender her evidence and agree to confinement for psychiatric delusions. She refused. Calm and deliberate, she told them she had anticipated exactly this tactic. Any confession or coerced surrender, she said, would be useless because she had already triggered legal and journalistic safeguards that would outlive her. The refusal broke whatever mask of civility they had worn. Judge Weatherby dropped the legal pretense and began describing in cold detail the methods the compact used to make people disappear without a trace. Peaton added gruesome examples cases Evangeline already knew well. He spoke of Congressman Hayes, Sarah Mitchell, and others boasting of how easily their deaths had been arranged. But to their surprise, Evangeline cut him off, listing their own crimes back to them and revealing that she had documented every detail and already spread the evidence. Then she revealed her most devastating card proof of the so-called Philadelphia incident, a catastrophic train derailment that killed more than 40 people and was publicly blamed on a mechanical fault. Evangeline said it had been engineered deliberately to kill a group of European investors traveling together, men who had been gathering evidence of fraud in American railroads. The mention of that derailment silenced the room. It was their deepest, darkest secret, a crime that tied the compact directly to multiple murders of foreign nationals and theft of government records, a crime with international implications that no amount of bribery could contain. In the tense stillness that followed, Dr. Sheffield opened his black medical bag and prepared a syringe, claiming it would bring her relief from delusions. But Evangeline had planned for this too. She had already taken a protective compound to counteract most sedatives and poisons, and she had placed objects around the room to serve as weapons if she needed them. When Weatherby ordered the men to seize her, she made her move. Using a hidden panel, she tried to reach the open window leading to her emergency escape route. Months before, she had hidden a rope ladder there that led down to a small boat waiting among the rocks below a boat stocked with supplies and evidence meant for allies in Providence. The plan had been her last resort if the compact ever confronted her directly. What happened next, as Flynn described with shaking hands, was chaos. A struggle that erupted into violence. A young heiress fighting desperately against men twice her size, and a desperate gamble to escape a conspiracy powerful enough to crush governments. And from that moment on, the night of August 14th spiraled into the mystery that has haunted Newport for more than a century. Flynn's final testimony revealed that Evangeline's last stand inside her chamber was as desperate as it was deliberate. When she attempted to reach the escape rope she had hidden months earlier, the two hired enforcers moved with ruthless precision, blocking her path and forcing her into a violent struggle. For a brief moment, it seemed she might succeed. Evangeline fought like someone who had prepared for this night all her life, striking, kicking, and twisting until she managed to hurl the leather case the one that contained her most damning evidence out through the open window. Flynn watched as it disappeared into the darkness, hoping as Evangeline clearly hoped that the sea or one of her allies offshore would carry it to safety. But the odds were against her. Within seconds, she was pinned, and Dr. Sheffield forced the contents of a syringe into her arm. Flynn described what happened next. In chilling detail, Evangeline did not fall unconscious. Instead, the drug locked her in her own body, leaving her awake, aware, and unable to move. She was forced to lie motionless, listening as Judge Weatherby and the others calmly discussed how she would be disposed of. They explained that once the drug had fully taken hold, she would be carried to a waiting boat in a secluded cove, taken out into the Atlantic, weighted and dropped into deep water where no one could ever recover her. Meanwhile, a fabricated story would circulate. She had eloped, fled to Europe, and died in a tragic accident. Even in that paralyzed state, Evangeline managed one last act of defiance. Flynn noticed that she triggered a hidden mechanism on the ring she wore. A faint puff of powder filled the air. It clung to fabric and skin, leaving a distinct odor that lingered for days and could mark anyone who had been in that room, a chemical fingerprint she had designed for just this contingency. Flynn also witnessed a moment that revealed the operation's wider scope. As Evangeline lay helpless, Judge Weatherby picked up the telephone on her desk. Speaking to someone outside the mansion, he reported, "The primary asset has been secured and the documentation issue has been contained. Recommend proceeding with Phase 2 of the containment protocol. The international complications should be resolved within 72 hours. Flynn realized that Evangeline's murder was part of a simultaneous campaign coordinated strikes across multiple cities, with Chicago and London mentioned explicitly. This testimony made it clear that what happened at Windward Hall that night was not just an isolated act of violence. It was the centerpiece of a carefully planned purge. And yet, even as the compact carried her limp body out of the room, Evangeline's precautions had already begun to take effect. 10 days later, on August 24th, 1893, three of the nation's biggest newspapers, the New York World, the Boston Herald, and the Philadelphia Inquirer, received thick packages mailed from multiple towns throughout New England. Inside were copies of the compact's most sensitive internal documents, financial records, coded correspondence, and a complete organizational chart, all accompanied by meticulous analyses prepared by Evangeline, Dr. Ashford, and their allies. These dossiers did more than prove the conspiracy. They predicted exactly how the compact would respond after her disappearance. As the predictions came true in the following weeks, witnesses intimidated, evidence seized, and certain figures relocated or killed, public belief in the documents hardened. For the first time, the public could see the deliberate pattern of corruption, murder, and control. The revelations triggered an explosion of public outrage and forced the federal government to act. Hearings were convened, prosecutions opened, and pressure mounted from abroad as European governments demanded answers for their murdered citizens. Yet even as the investigation closed, in the compact's power blunted the legal consequences. Within 2 weeks of the first newspaper stories, Heiress Cunningham himself died suddenly, officially, of a heart attack. The timing and symptoms pointed unmistakably to poisoning, but his death removed the key witness who could have implicated others. Evangeline's body was never found, but her evidence, hidden, scattered, and timed to be unstoppable, ensured that the empire she had fought would never fully recover. Her death marked the beginning of the end for the Newport Compact, even as most of its members escaped justice. The fallout from the Newport Compact's exposure unfolded like the slow collapse of a rotten structure, its decay revealed in a series of scandals, mysterious deaths, and failed attempts to erase what Evangeline Cunningham had unleashed. Theodore Peyton was the first to vanish. Days before federal marshals came to arrest him, he escaped using the compact's private network of safe houses and transport. He reappeared in Argentina, living under an assumed name on a remote estate where he continued to direct operations through coded letters and complex financial transfers. He never returned to the United States and died in 1923, an exile who had avoided justice but could never return home. Judge Cornelius Weatherby was quietly removed from the bench, ostensibly for health reasons. In reality, he negotiated a deal partial immunity in exchange for limited information about the compact's manipulation of the judicial system. His testimony sacrificed lesser associates and low-level operatives, but it was carefully shaped to protect the most powerful figures. He spent his last years in isolation on a private California estate watching the empire he helped protect crumble piece by piece. Dr. Edmund Sheffield did not live long enough to testify. Faced with mounting evidence, he was found dead in his office, with a gunshot wound officially ruled a suicide. Yet even this was tainted with suspicion. Many investigators believed he had been silenced to prevent him from revealing further details about falsified autopsies and the cover-ups he had orchestrated for decades. Of the 7 compact families, only 2 suffered serious legal consequences. These consequences, however, came in the form of heavy financial penalties and permanent exclusion from the highest social circles, not imprisonment. 3 patriarchs died mysteriously within months of the expose, their deaths consistent with the same elimination techniques they had once used against their own enemies. The rest weathered the storm, their reputations permanently damaged, but their wealth largely intact. As the public revelations spread, a quieter, deadlier campaign began: the systematic erasure of witnesses. Margaret Flynn, whose testimony had made it possible to reconstruct Evangeline's final hours, disappeared soon after giving her statement. Witnesses claimed they saw her boarding a train to Chicago with a single suitcase and an envelope of cash, but she was never seen again. Patrick O'Brien, the night watchman whose observations had corroborated Flynn's, drowned 3 months later in a mill pond, an accident that was implausible given his strong swimming ability. Dr. Helena Ashford lasted longer. She continued her medical work and advocacy for industrial workers even after the scandal broke. But her death in 1896 was as deliberate as it was disguised. She was found in her laboratory, overcome by chemical fumes, the victim of a tragic accident. Later examination revealed that the ventilation system in her lab had been deliberately tampered with, a sophisticated act of sabotage that left no obvious fingerprints. In total, at least 15 individuals tied to the investigation, witnesses, informants, or minor collaborators, died under suspicious circumstances between 1893 and 1897. Each death was spaced far enough apart in a different city, or under unique conditions that investigators who weren't looking for a pattern could dismiss them as coincidence. And yet, the long-term impact of Evangeline Cunningham's crusade went far beyond the Newport Compact. Her method, spreading evidence across multiple investigators and journalists, encrypting files, planting caches of documents in multiple locations, became a model for the next generation of investigative journalism. The first wave of muckraking reporters in the early 20th century cited the Newport scandal as their inspiration. Federal investigators, shamed by how easily the compact had operated for more than 15 years, began building new tools for tackling organized corporate crime. Over the following decades, agencies specialized in financial crime and political corruption emerged in direct response to the lessons of the compact. Internationally, the case forced the creation of new treaties and agreements to prevent U.S. business interests from committing crimes abroad without consequences. Several European nations created investigative units specifically to monitor American industrial activities within their borders. The Cunningham fortune, stripped of its connection to the railroads and tainted legacy, eventually passed to distant relatives. These inheritors with no ties to the compact sold off most of the family's holdings and used the money to create foundations for workers' safety, industrial accident prevention, and victims of corporate negligence. Windward Hall itself, the scene of Evangeline's last stand, became a symbol of haunting. It was sold, converted into a luxury hotel, and quickly gained a reputation for unexplained phenomena. Voices whispering through the walls, strange dreams containing forgotten historical details, documents that vanished when examined. Guests would claim to hear faint tapping in the servant corridors or wake with the scent of salt air and chemicals in the room. In 1932, a suspicious fire destroyed the building. It was demolished soon after erasing the physical site, but not its shadow. The leather case Evangeline threw from the window in her final act of defiance was never officially recovered, whether it lies buried in the sand taken by the sea or quietly found by her allies. That night remains one of the great unanswered questions of the case, a final mystery to a story that revealed just how much one determined young woman could shake an empire built on corruption and fear. There are persistent whispers about the fate of the leather case Evangeline Cunningham threw from her window that night. Some claim that it was recovered by local fishermen who understood its value and handed it quietly to federal investigators. According to these rumors, the case contained evidence far more explosive than anything the newspapers published, evidence implicating senators, congressmen, Supreme Court justices, and even foreign business networks, tied into a web of corruption far bigger than the Newport Compact itself. Historians who support this theory believe the contents were deliberately suppressed, locked away, to prevent revelations that could have shaken the very foundations of the American government. If true, the decision was calculated: sacrifice a few powerful men while protecting those whose exposure might have caused a nationwide crisis. The great unanswered question of the case remains the final fate of Evangeline's so-called insurance policy, the master document she prepared that not only documented past crimes, but predicted the compact's next moves. Parts of it were clearly included in the packages that reached the press and prosecutors, but there are persistent references to sections that were never made public. Some of her predictions revealed after her death came true exactly as she had written. Others, known only from private letters, were never published at all, fueling speculation that they remain locked away in government archives even now. Evangeline Cunningham's story stands as both a triumph and a cautionary tale. Through careful planning, deep alliances, and a visionary understanding of how corruption operated, she struck a blow that crippled one of the most dangerous conspiracies of her time. Her methods reshaped journalism, federal investigations, and public awareness. Yet her story also reveals the limits of even the bravest resistance. The Newport Compact as an organization was destroyed, but the majority of its members escaped with their fortunes intact. Wealth, power, and the machinery of influence endured just as she had feared. Her sacrifice forced reforms that protected countless workers, strengthened investigative reporting, and led to the creation of new agencies dedicated to fighting corruption. And yet the structures that enabled the compact to rise, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, were never dismantled. The mystery of Evangeline Cunningham is a reminder that justice and corruption are locked in a constant struggle. Even when the truth is buried under money and lies, there are moments when it resurfaces. Her case proves that one determined individual can change the world, even at terrible personal cost. So, what do you think? Was the entire truth ever revealed, or is there still more hidden away in private vaults and sealed archives? What really happened to the leather case she risked everything to save? And in our own time, could similar conspiracies still be operating more carefully, hidden but no less dangerous? Leave a comment with your theory. If this story of Gilded Age secrets and sacrifice captivated you, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves the dark mysteries of America's past. This is only one of many stories history tried to bury, and we intend to uncover them all.